Hi, welcome to Morning Talk Show. Today is a special day for me because this is my interview with one of my personal heroes, Dr. Iain McGilchrist. He wrote the book, The Master and His Emissary, The Divided Brain and the Making of the Western World, which is a sprawling work that covers so much more than just the divide between the left and right brain, but it actually just explodes that divided brain and the two sides of the brain out and expounds upon it, finding evidence for this divided brain in art and literature and history, and it's really been a huge book for me. And even before I read it, in interviews with him and lectures that he gave on the internet have just made a huge impact on my life. So he's got a new book called his new book is called The Matter with Things, and it picks up at where the divided brain left off and answers, or at least begins to set a context for answering or approaching some of the deepest questions about being a human. So I couldn't believe that I was able to speak to him, and I enjoyed the conversation so much. So we talk about his new book, and then partway through, I kind of took it in the direction of talking about longing and desire as kind of one of our possible entry points into a transformation and a transformed life, and possibly kind of transcending the materialist just worldview that has been kind of passively passed on to all of us. So I hope you like the conversation. Please like and subscribe and ring the bell to get notified about further conversations. Leave a comment below, and we've had some great conversation and comments on other videos, so I hope to get more of that. So thanks for watching. This is my interview with Iain McGilchrist, and I still can't believe I get to say that. Well, I see the sun shining through from the Isle of Skye behind you.
It's a very rare occasion.
Is that right? Is it kind of a gloomy place?
Yes, a lot of mist and rain, and utterly wonderful days. You know, because you get light playing. In fact, pure sunshine is quite disappointing because you need the clouds and the mist and things to give it the whole drama. You know.
Right. Yeah. I've listened to you speak enough, and that I actually, unlike most people that I would watch on YouTube or listen to, I actually imagine where you are. Like I've looked up the Isle of Skye. I kind of imagine you situated there. Do you tend to do you wander around? Like, do you like to get out and wander? Have you done that today or anything?
This afternoon, I went on a walk between 1:30 and 5:30 with some people that I've never met before, but got an introduction from a friend. And so, yes, I mean, I don't take as much exercise as I should, because the business of working on this new book has been all-consuming. I mean, it's really been shattering.
Wow.
It's been such a labor. I mean,
Well,
I've been a junior doctor in a system where they could make you work 120 hours a week, and you were dealing with all kinds of incredibly stressful situations. But you know, this has been very stressful.
Well, it's an internal thing as well, right? Like a lot of it probably is taking place in your mind, and yeah, that's a totally different kind of inescapable effort. Yeah. And clearly, I mean, clearly there's some internal drive that you have to clarify and illuminate all of these things that you probably can't shut off like a shift at a job in the same way or something.
No, exactly right. I got to a point where I could see that I was so far into this that I had to carry on, and there was a very long haul ahead.
Yeah.
But there really wasn't any way to avoid it. At a certain point, it was as if the book took over my life and me for a while and just demanded to be written.
Well, does it feel different than The Master and His Emissary did, or did you have a similar kind of possession for that?
No, it's different in a number of ways. I mean, The Master and His Emissary I wrote unbelievably, while I was still working 60 hours a week as a clinician. And I don't quite know how I did that, actually. I sometimes look at it and think, how did you find the time to do this? But in writing this new book, The Matter with Things, I've written it in the last 10 years, during which I've done no clinical work. I've really devoted myself to lecturing, writing, talking. So it's different in that respect. And I think it's just the sheer scale of it. To give you an idea, it's 1,600 pages in 2 volumes with 5,800 notes, a bibliography that's about 230 pages long in small print. And I've read them.
Yeah,
because you have to in this area.
Yeah.
And it's got over 100 illustrations. Everything about it is unusual. And everything about it demands the most incredible attention to detail. It's what I call the left hemisphere's revenge. You know, the last 8 or 9 months, I've just been, my brain's gone into a knot of phenomenal attention to detail.
Right. Yeah. The left, that's kind of hilarious, because your first book, I mean, we're just right into things here, but your first book, which I listened to the 54 hours of on audiobook, is attempting to, for people who, I mean, I can't imagine someone watching this interview who knows me but doesn't know you. That seems impossible. But anyway, if they don't, that book was about reestablishing the preeminence of the right brain, of the less detail oriented, the less abstracted, the more holistic part of the brain. And so, and now you're saying that the left side of your brain, which got short shrift in that, or was maybe spoken about in not the most glowing terms in the first book. Well, not your first book, but in The Master and His Emissary, is now an extremely necessary part of this second book, even more so than before. So how would you sum up the matter with things? You've probably done it briefly many times. Do you have a brief way to say what it is?
Yes.
I've heard, but yeah.
I should have the elevator pitch. Yes. It's basically taking on where the Master and His Emissary left off, because it was obvious to me that if I'm right, that the world comes into being differently for the two halves of the brain, because they pay different attention, and the kind of attention you pay alters what you find, and it alters you. So it's a reciprocal effect. And so it really meant thinking about, not just in abstract terms about the difference between the hemispheres, and not just about the historical way in which this has played out in the history of Western Europe, which I dealt with in the second part of the Master and His Emissary, but really about the most basic questions. Who are we? What is the world? And what is our relationship with the cosmos? Small questions, eh? So that's why it's a big book. But it seems to me very important, because I don't have to mention, obviously, the terrific problems that we face, the business of the assault on nature, the devastation of the way of life of indigenous peoples all over the world. And even, it seems to me that we are now rapidly committing suicide as a civilization. We're doing everything we can to destroy what is best about it. These are very serious problems, but if there's one thing that's more serious, it's about the philosophy of who we are and what the world is that underlies all those problems. It's because we don't have a proper idea at all of who we are or of what the world is, that we've got ourselves into these situations. And even if we could get out of those situations, it wouldn't be any good if we carried on thinking and behaving in the same way. So we have to change.
Yeah.
And it's my attempt to explain why the way that we have often been told to think about ourselves and the world, which is a materialist, reductionist account, that effectively the world is an inert mechanism, that we human beings are the playthings of chance, that we are basically programmed to compete with one another to the death. All of this is completely wrong, not just philosophically, but it has no basis in science. Science doesn't compel you to believe any of this. It's a philosophy that has hijacked the sane and dignified voice of science. And it's very loud these days in a lot of the public voices of science, and not just science, of politics and beyond. So what I'm trying to do is to show, first of all, that this is a very unusual way to think about the world. And when you look at how the two halves of the brain conceive the world, you can see that this is deeply skewed towards a certain viewpoint, which is the one that the left hemisphere holds. And I'm able to show that, I don't know if you want me to go into any more detail actually at this stage, but
Please.
okay, yeah.
No, yeah.
I think it goes in 3 parts. There are 3 parts to the book, actually, although it's in 2 volumes. The first 2 parts in volume 1 are entitled The Way to Truth, or The Ways to Truth. Now, that's rather a bold thing to say, because like most people, I'm prepared to believe that truth is never simple or single, but we can't dispense with the idea of truth. If we didn't think that some things were truer than others, we couldn't say anything, we couldn't do anything, we wouldn't have any reason for getting out of bed in the morning, certainly not for listening to this podcast. So we must believe there is some kind of a truth. It's how do we access it? And I suggest that there are 6 or 7 ways in which we have, if you like, access to whatever reality there is that is not simply generated by our minds. Because I don't believe that everything I'm doing now is just generated by my mind, that you are a phantasm of my imagination. I believe there is a world, and that we all, in our different ways, we see different aspects of it, we bring it into being slightly differently, but nonetheless, there is a core reality. Now, how do we get any kind of portals on that? Any sort of ways in which we can look into that reality and take it on board? Well, I believe that the main ones would be, probably we could argue about the detail, but they're probably things like attention in the first place. If you don't attend in a certain way, you won't find anything there. And the way you attend alters what you find. Then there's perception, which is not the same as attention, but is obviously related to attention. And then thirdly, there's the judgments that we form, both on our attention and our perception. And those judgments in turn are informed by our emotional and social intelligence, and by our cognitive intelligence, good old-fashioned IQ, and by our capacity for creative thinking. These are the ways in which we get to grips with and understand reality at the most basic level. I take each of these at a time and show that the right hemisphere is better able to use these and uses them more intelligently than the left hemisphere. The left hemisphere is prone to delusions. So the subtitle of my book is Our Brains Are Delusions and the Unmaking of the World, because that's what I believe we're doing. We're unmaking the world with our brains. Our brains are there to make the world, but we're using them now to destroy the world.
I love that.
So the thing that the part 1 tells us is 2 things, really, 2 important things. One is that, quite simply, the right hemisphere is more reliable. In other words, we would get caught out by reality much more often if we trusted in the world according to the left hemisphere. we would believe all kinds of crazy things, and we suddenly find that life was unlivable because we simply weren't in touch with it. Whereas if we believe largely what the right hemisphere believes, we've got an in on realities. That's the first thing. The second thing is that we now know what the signature or the hallmark of a left hemisphere take on something is. And if we want to avoid being mistakenly taken by a paradigm, by a take on the world, if we wish to avoid being mistaken, it's good for us to know whether this kind of a way of looking at the world is likely to come from the right hemisphere or from the left, because we can establish that the right hemisphere is more veridical. Now that's a step forward, because mainly in philosophy, one is faced with the fact that, well, there are two different ways of looking at this, or, half a dozen ways, of course, but there are often paradoxes, and we have to say, well, this looks, like it's probably true. This, which doesn't fit with it at all, also looks like it's possibly true. We just have to shrug our shoulders and go, well, we don't know. Well, now we don't need to, because in fact, I have a whole chapter on paradox in which I take, I don't know, about 30 academic paradoxes recognized by philosophers, and show how they can be viewed with benefit as being the two ways in which the same thing is construed by the left and the right hemisphere.
Oh, wonderful.
And the left hemisphere's take on it is usually the one that we can't possibly believe. Thus, for example, Achilles and the tortoise. Should I just gloss that and say?
Yeah, very briefly, because I don't know that particular one. Sorry.
Yeah, so this is a paradox of Zeno, who's an ancient Greek philosopher. And Achilles was famed for his swiftness of foot. And the tortoise challenges Achilles to a race. And Achilles just sort of laughs. And the tortoise says, no, you can never overtake me. And so Achilles just laughs. And he gives, being a generous guy, he gives the tortoise a big head start. Now, Zeno can prove that, in fact, the tortoise is right, that Achilles can never overtake the tortoise, because Achilles' first task is to get to where the tortoise started.
Okay, yeah.
But by the time he gets there, the tortoise has moved on. So now he's got to get to the place where the tortoise then is. But by the time he's got there, the tortoise has moved on. And so in smaller and smaller increments, he's getting closer to this tortoise, but never able to overtake it.
Right.
Now that, I can explain why that is a typical fallacy that comes from the thinking of the left hemisphere. And obviously, we know that Achilles can overtake the tortoise. So, and most of these paradoxes, we know perfectly well that in the real world, certain things happen that way. But a logical argument appears to suggest something that's deeply counterintuitive. Yeah.
Right.
So that's the point of part one. Part two, I can sum up very quickly. It's like we've talked about the portals or the entry points on reality. What about the paths that we would follow, the longer term paths towards some truth about reality? Well, I think everyone would agree that science is going to be one of them, a very important one. And another is likely to be reason. I think most people would accept that. Not everybody, but most people would probably accept that intuition is another important way in which we arrive at certain understandings of truth. And I would argue the imagination is too very important. I think actually that we misunderstand what is meant by imagination, what is meant by science, what is meant by reason, but that's another story. But when you look at them as they are most valuable, again, each of them is required. They're not necessarily in conflict. And the best part of them is provided by the right hemisphere, not the left. And this is true of science, and it's true of reason. I spent a lot of time rehearsing how it was that scientists and mathematicians made their great discoveries and great leaps forward. And as has been recognized by a number of important 20th century scientists, they never, or very rarely, made their great advances by following the scientific method, by testing to exhaustion all sorts of possibilities.
Right.
And,
Yeah.
instead, they saw something that they saw a gestalt, a new form
Right.
that answered something. And it often came in a flash. It doesn't mean that they didn't have to do a lot of hard work before that flash would come, but it didn't come from the left hemisphere's procedural plodding. It came from the right hemisphere. And there's absolutely incontrovertible evidence that those aha moments of intuitive insight come from the right superior temporal sulcus.
Einstein on the bus, I believe. There was a time when Einstein was on the bus imagining the theory of relativity as an imaginative exercise. That kind of thing is what you're kind of referring to. It wasn't a formula. It was like imagining the bus traveling and the light traveling, and it was all in the imagination.
Yes, his daughter refers to him sometimes in the middle of trying to work out his theory of relativity, sitting at the piano and playing chords, and then suddenly going, "I've got it," and going upstairs and writing things down.
Amazing.
And interestingly, there is a story also of Poincaré, Henri Poincaré, who was an early 20th century, late 19th century, early 20th century French mathematician. And he, sorry, that's Schrodinger's cat that's got him.
Oh,
I did tell
awesome. No, he's welcome. He or she is welcome.
I told Schrodinger to keep that cat out of it. And obviously I thought it was dead. It's all too alive. And
that answers that, I guess.
Yeah, you're dead. Off you go. So yes, Poincaré anyway it describes this thing about how he was. He spent 2 weeks trying to come to an understanding of what he later called Fuchsian equations. And one day he just sort of gave up and went into town. And as he put his foot on the step of the bus to go back to his house, suddenly he saw what it was. And it took him, a while to write it down. But so in any case, what I'm really saying is that the most valuable parts of reason, without the right hemisphere's contributions to reason, it makes a big contribution to reason. It's completely wrong to think that sort of science and reason are left hemisphere. They're not. They're a balance of the two. And if they lose the balance, they become, pale imitations of what they should be.
Right.
So effectively, what I'm suggesting is that you can't tackle a problem by simply using one of science, reason, intuition, or imagination. They need to be held in balance, and we need to respect the right hemisphere contributions to them. So that's volume 1.
Wow.
And then there's volume 2, which is the part 3, which this has been leading to. And it's called What Then Is True? So in other words, it's an interrogative, not a statement. But I'm asking, what can we come to feel we have a reasonable understanding of, that it's more likely that it's like this than not?
Yeah.
And I'm looking at the really fundamental questions, the structure of the cosmos, time, space, matter, consciousness, value, purpose, and the sense of the sacred.
Wow.
And so this is why it's a long book.
Yeah.
And in the first 2 chapters of that part, I look at the coincidentia oppositorum, the coincidence of opposites, which is an important point that in our Newtonian world we have failed to respect, but in other cultures is understood and was in our own up until about the 17th century. And then the paradoxes of the one and the many, how these elements of uniqueness and the general, the one and the many, how they relate to one another. And then off into, as I say, time, space, matter, consciousness, and the rest of it. So, sorry, that was a very, very long. You said you must have a short version of what's going on about. No. Sorry, I don't.
Well, I mean, my level of interest will support any amount of words you wanted to say on it. So that it was a long elevator ride, but it It could still have been said on an elevator if there were a lot of people getting on and off at different floors. But
In
no,
the
it's
Empire State Building, yeah, yeah.
exactly, yeah. It's wonderful though. And so one of the first things that struck me when you were describing what this book is about is how it actually really answers something that was coming up in my mind over and over as I finished The Master and His Emissary, which was that um, okay, how will I put this? Okay, The Master and His Emissary. I found the discussions of things like art and that kind of thing near the end to be so kind of nuanced that there wasn't a clear and obvious agenda that you had. You know, like many times when I've heard people discuss like modern art, for example, they'll kind of ascribe a negative motivation to modern art in a way that doesn't jive with the modern artists that I know. But what you were discussing was so kind of like you'd go in a certain direction and I'd say, okay, maybe going this way. And then you'd kind of express that okay, the great
Okay.
contribution of modernism was this, and here's this book of poetry that suggests that with the freedom, the seeming freedom that modernism brought, there was a lot of dross, but there was a lot of gold that would never have been discovered in the Romantic era, in which there were fewer luminaries and more tepid, people at the margins.
Yes.
And so the thing that kept coming up, the only conclusion I could come up with is that we're really left, if we really want to engage with all of that left brain, right brain stuff, we're really left with just trying to be more human, just trying to understand what the human is, because it seems to me that the right brain is what connects us to being increasingly human, whatever that, which is a mysterious thing, and the left brain is what increasingly cuts us off from our humanity, which is kind of an unfortunate thing. That, I mean, it's really unfortunate that we even have that capacity to be cut off from our humanity. And I think it's what's being described in the Garden of Eden. I think it's the first human story in the Bible is that's just an opinion.
Well, the eating of the apple from the...
Yeah, exactly.
Yes,
It was the beginning of the intellect that was able to separate us from God.
Yes. I mean, that myth of the apple of the tree of knowledge is really the tree of the kind of knowledge that the left hemisphere has.
Yes.
Anyway, sorry, you were in the...
No, that's okay. I'm glad to know that you agree with that, because that's kind of one of the things that comes up for me quite a lot. So then it's really great to see that you tackle the issues that kind of felt like I needed that whole Master and His Emissary to get to these very simple questions, a 54-hour audiobook that leaves you with nothing but some simple questions like, what am I? Which are simple, but obviously, simple but massive, like move this mountain from there to there. It's a simple task, but but it's not easy. And so one of the I guess elephants in the room for me when we're talking about this this new book and this materialist mindset that has been developing is that, and maybe you can comment on this. I come from a religious background, a very religious background. And one of the things that I was certain was calling me away from religion and probably away from God at one point. I was preparing for that eventuality. Was that there was this oddly, now I'm describing it as left hemispheric view of God that predominated the religion that I was in. And so all I knew was I had to get out of what I'm now recognizing as an ideology. I had to, I actually had a kind of an impactful moment with scripture where I read, go from this place in your father's house to the land that I will show you, which hit me like a ton of bricks in kind of a revelatory way. And I knew that I had to get out, and I didn't know what that meant. And as I went along that path, I discovered people like yourself, and then lo and behold, I did not become a materialist, but I realized that in some ways I was more of a materialist when I was deeply involved in a religion. which is kind of a massive tension, because it feels like belief in a grand mysterious God should be the least materialist, position to hold in a way. But then God was made into a material, was brought into the known, was brought into the left hemisphere, and there were a lot of fences put up. So I guess, what's your sense? Because, like, historically, religion has probably been part of what kept the right hemispheric sense alive.
Yeah.
And then and nowadays there is at least a noisy strand of it that seems to be doing the opposite. Does that resonate? Does that seem true with what you've been researching and thinking?
Yes, I'd like to talk more about that. The chapter of the book that cost me most pains was the chapter called "The Sense of the Sacred," which, apart from the epilogue, is the last chapter in the book, and it's pretty much the length of a short book itself, because it's such a difficult and important topic. And I found that everything that one could say was problematic, and that, it was going to need what you're calling a lot of nuancing. And one thing I'd like to say about that, just before we come to talk about the religious thing, is that I know you were shorthand, you were speaking in shorthand, but you sort of said, you gave the impression that I think the left hemisphere is entirely negative, that it's
right.
And I think it is when it takes control. This comes back to this very simple idea that it's a very good emissary, but a very poor master. And in fact, it turns out that Einstein said something almost exactly like that, which I didn't know at the time I read the book. I think he said the rational mind is a useful servant, and the intuitive mind is a precious gift.
Oh, wow.
We worship the servant and have forgotten the gift.
Right.
Actually, I can't trace that to anywhere in Einstein, but there we go. But the idea is a good one, and it's in many religions around the world. Actually, it's in Zen, it's in Taoism, it's in the Vedanta, it's even in North American native peoples' mythologies. All over the world, people have this sense that it's something that is constantly striving to usurp the part of our mind that is really wise, and it can talk loudly and it can be very pushy, but largely because it doesn't know very much. It thinks it knows everything, and that's the danger of it. So we need a left hemisphere. And one of the important, I wouldn't think it would be better if we all had a left hemisphere stroke. No. So the point is that we need often contradictory elements. This comes back to the union of opposites that I was talking about, as in the first chapter of part 3 of the book. Nothing good happens without resistance. Everything needs its opposite. Everything needs. There is no creative anything that can happen without that resistance being acknowledged. Two things that may make that sound slightly more plausible, just small images. One is that in order to move, there must be friction. And the whole point about friction is it stops movement. But without it, we couldn't move at all. And in psychiatry, one of the things that I found I was constantly helping people to do was to accept what Jung would have called the dark side, not to try and deny it or excise it, because then it becomes powerful, dangerous, tyrannical, but to accept it humbly. And it brings healing when you do that. It's extraordinarily important, but it's something that particularly in a culture in which we're constantly told that we must, do this and excel at that and be beautiful and be healthy. And, everybody's so highly competitive in the social media world that it's very hard for anyone to acknowledge any longer their vulnerability. The one thing that's missing from debate at the moment is all about power. We must have power. You must have power. There must be power against power. But one of the great insights of all great religions and the mystical traditions of them is the power of no, the power of not saying, the power of not doing, the power of not acting. In fact, of making oneself in a certain way vulnerable that makes one extraordinarily powerful to be able to do good things. So anyway, that's just a vignette there. But so I think it's very important that there's both the right and the left. And when you come to talk about religion, and one of the things that I knew very little about until recently, until perhaps the last 10 years, was the scriptures and the mythology of Judaism, and particularly the Kabbalah. And it's been a complete revelation to me. And in the Judaic tradition, there are two kind of brother or sister elements in the soul, and they're called Halakha and Agada. And Halakha is the one that makes rules and boundaries and rituals and makes things explicit and wants them written down, and is much more, less nuanced, more about it's right this way, it's not right that way. Whereas Agada is open to the understanding of all the things that essentially are what the right hemisphere is good at, understanding the implicit, that things are a matter of degree, that they're interconnected with many other things, including their opposites, that they're always changing and flowing, that, we must respect things' uniqueness, not just the fact that they belong in a certain box or category of rules. So both of those are important, says Abraham Heschel, who is, I think, a utterly brilliant and no doubt very good man, a New York rabbi of the last century. And he says, Halakha and Agada need one another, but when God gave his people corn and wine, Halakha was the corn, Agada was the wine. That reminds me of sort of Sufism, which in Sufism, you see the very much more Agada-like aspect of Islam, the part that accepts the mysterious coming together of opposites, of the implicit, of the place, of humor, of paradox, of music, of poetry. And obviously against it, there is a fundamentalist streak, which is the caricature of this left hemisphere way of looking at religion.
It reminds me of Apollo and Dionysus.
Well, there is that as well. And of course, in that book, I do, flirt a little bit with that Nietzschean idea in The Master and His Emissary. Although I think that that's somewhat different because, well, anyway, we won't go into that because it'll go off on a whole tangent. But to come back to the religion, what I think is that most religious traditions have these two elements in them. And because so much of religion has been presented as to do with propositions, believing certain truths, a creed, that a lot of people are put off by the idea that, in order to have any kind of understanding of the divine or the sacred, they've got to believe 6 impossible things before breakfast, and that is not the case. Belief is not a matter of subscribing to propositions. And those propositions, by the way, are to be understood as the right hemisphere would understand them, as myths, narratives, parables, not as factual, literal truths like a chemistry book.
Right.
And this causes a lot of confusion when people like what's his name, Jerry Coyne, wrote a book called Faith versus Fact.
Okay.
And he rather like a number of these extreme atheists, fundamentalist atheists, takes the view that if it's not true in the sense that it is in a chemistry book, then it's just not true. It's just a way of saying it's a lie. Well,
yeah.
So is all great art and music, is King Lear just a lie because does it not contain truth, even though it's a fable? The real King Lear was not at all like the one that Shakespeare talked about, and so on.
Yeah. No.
So I think that, science has got itself into locked horns with religion. I don't know quite why, although I have some thoughts on why this happened, but it seems to have happened in the middle of the 19th century, 1830s, 1840s, through particularly to the 50s, 60s, and 70s. And that really did come from science. It picked battles with religion, and religion behaved rather badly in response, because you tend to mirror the faults that are, being demonstrated to you. And so they became defensive and extreme in their positions too, in a most unenlightening way. And there were lots of things put about, such as that, until Columbus sailed to America, people believed the world was flat, and if you went to the edge, you'd fall off it, Well, actually, that's a 19th century invention, and actually, going back to 2,000 years, most educated people knew that the world was round. So, and so on and so forth.
Interesting, yeah.
But I can understand how you'd want to get back to an aspect of religion that is more right hemisphere based, and I think that if we could help people to see that it's not this matter of dogmatism, it would, I think a lot of people who call themselves agnostics would start to see themselves as open to something spiritual. Because if you ask people, are you a signed up believer in a certain religion? In England, I think, because we're a very godless race, I think about 11% of people will say they are. But if you ask people, do you believe there's more to the world than the materialist account gives credit for? 90% of people will say, oh, yes.
Yeah.
And a lot of them have had experiences that they say, were to them like an experience of the divine. So, it's not a rare experience. It's just that people are terribly put off by the dogmatism of certain kinds of Christianity. And I see the big divide as not being between believers and atheists, but being between fundamentalist believers and fundamentalist atheists on the one hand, who are very, very similar.
Yes.
And the more nuanced agnostics on the other, and believers who are able to admit elements of what I would call the subtlety of the right hemisphere into their view.
Transcendent atheism is something that I've been kind of searching for, because I have this deep suspicion that there are some really inspiring atheists who have had really amazing insights because they've kind of set God aside, but they've not made that into a fundamentalist presupposition. They're just like, I've never seen that God, so let's examine life from that perspective. And I don't really consider those people to be materialists in a way. What I found with my own religion was that you talked about belief and truth being contained in mythology and story, and that's what I found was that I was raised in a Southern Baptist fundamentalist situation, and yet I think just probably it was a blessing of my personality that the that the encoded truths and the encoded wisdom and beauty of the Bible and of Christianity was always there, and occasionally it was a guilty pleasure. I could, as I got older, I could imagine what if God is all of reality? What if God is another description for reality and for the animating principle that causes cells to divide, and that that Rupert Sheldrake would say is the God is creating echoes, or God is the echoes of of form and function throughout time, and all of that kind of thing. What if and my brain was always able to go there, and so it was kind of this paradoxical thing where I think my brain was probably able to go there because it exists in mythology, and it exists there. It communicates, like the depths of these stories communicated with the depths of my subconscious and my right brain. And so I am concerned, or I devote a surprising amount of my time, sort of like this book for you was uh, almost inescapable. A part of my brain is always churning on what on religion and faith and on God specifically, because I can never drop it. I can never just drop it and walk away, and I can never embrace it. I feel at odds with many people, and even one of the people who's been on the show a couple of times on the podcast, John Vervaeke, has been for a long time flirting with religion, and I just noticed he was even recently on Unbelievable, which is a British Christian show, and yet he's not a Christian. And so his idea is that we need a religion that's not a religion, and he's kind of trying to begin hashing out what that would be. And I have extreme reservations about that. At one point he was calling for artists to express these ideas, and I thought, I had just this almost like a trauma response from being a young musician at church and being told I needed to put my musicianship towards singing these fairly vapid songs for Jesus, and so this isn't really a question so much as I wonder if we're kind of in an axial age between religion actually being a portal for access to the right brain world, or access to the sort of more mysterious world. We're in an axial age where religion needs to kind of evolve to continue doing maybe what it has done, and what it's supposed to have done in history. Like never perfectly, because it's been human beings, pushing religion forward, and moving religion forward. I guess, okay, I'll try and turn this into a question instead of a rant, because I have one of my favorite intellectuals on the screen and I'm talking way too much. But what do you see as a way forward, especially in the light of and I don't mean this as an offense to you, but that many people will not read something like The Master and His Emissary. They won't read the new book, and nor do I have judgment for people who, in this world with 40-hour work weeks and more, and so much, so much to try and do. So what is a way forward? Like, everything in what you've written resists to me a rigid ideology, and what it actually implies is looking for a real understanding of the reality of being a human being, and of the reality of being a group, and of a culture, the reality of being an animal on a planet with other animals, and the reality of being a kind of a transcendent animal on that planet. So yeah, what do you have a sense of the way forward, to sort of communicate some of these things out, and try and actually start shifting the the mass consciousness?
Yes. I suppose what I would say is that what I aim to do is to help people see things that they really already know. In fact, if they don't already know it at some level, they won't understand it. And that's not because it's something peculiar about my work. That's true of everything, every kind of philosophy. If you don't, in a sense, already understand it, then the understanding won't come to you. So what I'm hoping to do is to unveil a way of looking at the world, to say, I think we can do better than this intellectually impoverished, morally jejune, and spiritually unfulfilling view that we are just pieces of machinery and the world is pieces of machinery and just get used to it. I don't believe this at all. Everything about everything I've studied, and I'm a person who's incorrigible and keeps going off down different paths, but everywhere I find a coherent picture. The thing that I like in my book is that if you take the best in neurology, in philosophy, and in modern physics, although they start from very different places, they end up describing a very similar reality. And that's very reassuring, because you'd like to believe that if they were aiming for a reality, that it would be a similar reality. And what's even more wonderful is that that reality is one that would not surprise or shock somebody 2,000 years ago. It's just that we've completely forgotten a lot of these things. So I do think that we need to put out the messages that I try to deliver in these books. And I don't want to tell people what to do. People often say, so what should we do? And I always think, well, that's the left hemisphere kind of getting sort of windy and thinking, oh, goodness, what are we going to do? We've got to sort this problem. And it's really not like that, because if we do that, we'll just do the sorts of things that we've been doing. We'll have 8 bullet points, and those will be the things that if we do them, everything will be fine. But it's not going to be like that. We're going to have to re-envision what a human being is and what the world is. So that's really what I hope with this book. I know it's too long, really, for most people, and I utterly sympathize. I usually say about the Master and His Emissary that it's so long that, if I hadn't actually written it, I'd never have had time to read it. And, ipso facto, this book is going to be a problem because it's bigger. But what I like to think is that it doesn't have to be digested at one go, that, people can, there's a structure to it. And there are 3 chapters on science, there are 3 chapters on reason, there are 3 chapters on intuition and imagination. And so one can dip into those, and one can look at the world picture that I show what the world would look like if we had failed really to take into account all that the right hemisphere is able to tell us. And I look at patients and people who suffer in this way, and the parallels with the way our world is and is increasingly going are shocking. And I think readers will see that very clearly. So I think those things are there almost as resources. And I like to think that I've got something new to say about really big questions, like the relationships between matter and consciousness, and about the nature and importance of time. A lot of people, including the great religious people, say that time is not real. Time is an illusion. It's a very comforting thing to say, but I don't believe it. One thing that makes me cross is that people say that, people who believe in religious things do so in order to comfort themselves. Certainly not. Some of it is not at all comforting. I've been in this world through having at times, thankfully short-lived, but very severe bouts of depression 3 or 4 times that are so dark, those places. I know they exist. I know they're there, that a soul can be tormented in that way. And, that's in this world. I don't know what happens at death. There may be absolutely no more of anything that continues from me, in which case I won't be there to complain about it. But I think it's quite possible that in some form, my consciousness will contribute to whatever global consciousness there is. And in that case, religion is hardly wholly a comfort. And also, I was brought up by parents who really had very little time for religion, and it was never forced on me. But I just, as soon as I encountered it, my school had a medieval chapel, 14th century chapel. And to hear the music of the Renaissance, of Palestrina and Victoria and Tallis and Byrd and Lassus and all these great people, and to hear the words of the Book of Common Prayer written, by Cranmer, at the point when the English language was at its absolute most expressive. This was a complete eye-opener to me. It was wonderful. And I didn't say, oh, this doesn't make any sense. I thought this is talking about the things that can only be talked about in this way. Niels Bohr said, two important things. One is that we can only talk about the physics of the subatomic world in what is effectively poetic terms. And he also said about religions talk in terms of metaphors, narratives, and myths, because that is actually the only way in which certain profound truths can be conveyed, which is why we have a very high opinion of great poets and playwrights. And because they are the ones that are able to communicate things that if we just baldly state them, we've missed completely.
Right. Yeah. So, sorry, go ahead.
Yeah.
One of the things that comes to mind, actually, that I can see in your work, perhaps you can tell me if I'm wrong, is that one of the ways forward. And by the way, I don't mean to insult your books by saying people won't read them and that kind of thing. I just
I'm not that easly insulted.
Okay, good.
Completely true. I mean, it's blatantly true. Okay, so
Okay, but I think what is sort of taking shape in my mind is a sense that the truths that you're referring to are actually things that we deeply long for, and that maybe one of the modernist, one of the downsides of the modernist view and of the left hemisphere view is that we begin to try to dictate or deny our longings, and that really the moment of change for people, the reason I was able to read, and I'm not actually a very good reader. I have issues with reading. I can listen, but I have issues with reading. But the reason I was able to get through the Master and His Emissary was because I longed for what you were giving in that book, and something in me really needed to hear it and wasn't hearing it in a lot of places. And it strikes me that art and religion and all of that speak to the longing, and we actually, as a function of not being transparent to ourselves, we don't know what our longings might be these days. It's increasingly people are increasingly unaware. And actually, a bit of your book came to mind as in regards to longing, and it was when you were speaking about modernist art and the attempts to step outside of artistic traditions and of considerations of sort of making art for the human being, and almost in a self-conscious way dictating a new aesthetic seemingly out of nowhere. And what struck me was that when modernism occurred, art was probably as accessible to people as it had ever been. People could see art. There are an increasing number of ways to reproduce art, to show people. I can look at the Mona Lisa on my screen, and it almost struck me that possibly one level of the most modernist, the most inhuman art, is that it reveals a longing in people that they, and I don't think it ever comes to the conscious mind, because the performative side of viewing that art won't really let you acknowledge this. But I wonder if maybe even in that most inhuman form of art, if people might be experiencing a vacuum that is speaking to that longing. And so I wonder if one of the ways forward is not really intellectual so much as just trying to help people to acknowledge their own longings and then see where they go from there. Because even those modern artists had a longing to escape something, or possibly escape a tyranny or something like that. And it's a relatable impetus, in a way. So yeah, I wonder if there's anything to that idea, because I feel like it took shape based on your writings. That longing is one of our kind of non-intellectual ways that we can begin, that the dominoes can begin to fall.
Absolutely. And I'd just like to mention a book by a famous biochemist, professor at Yale, called Erwin Chargaff, who wrote a book called Heraclitean Fire, which is absolutely wonderful on this topic and about how this relates to really creative scientific work. But that theme of longing is an important one because it can be deconstructed as something which is just wishful thinking, as it were.
Mm.
And what you and I are talking about is not that. It's an awareness of the fact that we are limited and that there are things outside that we can sense out beyond, almost at the fringes of what we're capable of getting, that are
Yes.
very, very important. And that at times we do get them. That's the thing that reinforces this, that at times we are granted some sort of fulfillment of that longing. And the image is a very good one because, the word comes from an Anglo-Saxon root, langian, which means to stretch out. And one of the
Mm-hmm.
ways I think of individual consciousness is that it's somehow like an outpouching of a vast sea of consciousness.
Mm.
Because what creation wants is neither to deny union or division. There should be individuation. It's all about the individuation that we couldn't have foreseen, the creative newness of all these wonderful beings. And yet at the same time, they're not atomistically distinct or at war with one another.
Mm.
They are, if you like, generated out of this field of consciousness.
Mm.
So the idea for me is that in this world, we are often aware of connections to things that we know we are connected to. And they are the profoundest moments of our lives. And for people who are not in any way religiously inclined, if they've ever really been in love, then they know just how powerful and quite remarkable the feeling of longing is, how it brings with it actually a sense of the transcendental, of all kinds of things that, for
Mm.
many people now are cut off because they're almost brought up to believe that religion is, irrational and probably a bad element in our culture. But of course, if we actually turn our backs on those longings, then we miss most of the things that are valuable. And in fact, by paying attention to the things that I have longed for, that I have had such an enriched life, really, my passion for poetry, my fascination with neurology, the sort of really transcendental feel of a wild and beautiful landscape. These are the
Mm.
things, music, which can't be exchanged for anything in the universe. It's just itself. And it's so powerful and so moving.
Yes.
And it can't be reduced to any kind of a formula or to anything else at all. And if you take it apart, you're just left hopelessly with a heap of notes, none of which mean anything. So these processes to which one feels oneself somehow attached and one responds. I like to think of the stretching not as inert, but as elastic, in a sense, that there is something there that is calling to us. We are responding to that calling, and even calling back to it and so on. This is an idea that George Steiner is extraordinarily good at expressing in his book, Real Presences.
Mm.
Anyway, so longing is important. And indeed, I gave a talk which is on the internet called either Longing and Wanting or Wanting and Longing,
Okay.
because I wanted to make the distinction between wanting something and
Right.
longing for something,
Right.
and the different qualities of these experiences, and how one opened a door to spirituality and how one closed it down.
Right.
So, I mean, it's a longish talk with
Oh, I
a
will listen to
discussion
it.
after. Anyway, yes.
I will look it up and
There
listen
we
to
are.
it.
It was at Heathrow College in London, which is a theological college, and they asked me to
Mm.
give the talk. So,
Yeah.
yes, I think that idea is an utterly profound one, and again, it's, if one denies it, then one loses a sense. One automatically becomes smaller than
Mm.
one becomes a dwarf of oneself, really, if you know what I mean.
Yeah.
In fact, somebody said, actually, that I can't remember who it was, who said, modern men are dwarves of themselves. They're no
Mm.
longer what they have the potential to be. As something I feel very strongly, that
Mm.
we don't fulfill a quarter of our potential because, first of all, we're told that we don't have that potential, and secondly, we're told not to strive for anything, really, that we should just
Right.
accept whatever it is that we have, and
Yeah.
yeah.
Are you
So
familiar? Oh, are you familiar with the hymn "Come Now, O Love Divine"?
I
It
am, yes.
it's something that struck me. I wrote it down. I keep a list of kind of inspiring, I guess you could say, poetry. I call them prayers, but I wrote that one down. And one of the things that struck me about that was that it's come now, O love divine, seek now this soul of mine and visit it with thine own ardor glowing. It begins with an invitation, but the last verse, and this is what makes, I think, poetry instead of just a wanting, is uh, it says, and so the yearning strong with which the soul will long will far outpass the power of human telling, for none can guess its grace until they become the place in which the Holy Spirit finds a dwelling. Uh,
Right.
and that's
Mm,
that's kind of what I think of when you're talking here. That came into my mind,
mm,
and I also think
mm,
about I've got a 7-month-old baby, and it strikes me that life begins with unfortunately what could be the illusion of uncomplicated and total communion between mother and child.
mm. Yes.
And there's not a great, I mean, there may be a great sense of longing for a few moments when the baby is hungry. And maybe this is a weird analogy to throw at you, but then as self-consciousness begins, and as the baby individuates, that
Mm,
becomes a kind of a lifelong longing
mm,
to return to the kind of connection that they had at the very beginning. And I think maybe another left brain possible red herring is the idea of the capturing of and the finding of the achieving of what we're longing for being a satisfying thing. Whereas
mm,
when we get what we want, it might be a satisfying thing when we eat the ice cream cone. But any actual capturing of that thing we're longing for will probably, if it's that deepest longing, it will probably end up having been a surrogate or a
yes.
stand-in. And
Yes.
yeah, go ahead.
When we're wanting something, we're wanting a gift, but the longing is itself the gift.
Yes.
It's it fulfills itself in a way,
Yeah.
and it's a deep way of being, if you like, in the world. Without longing, we seem to skate more over the surface of it. It seems to me,
Hmm.
and it's a very powerful human feeling, which in most people has been attached also to place. But we're now so uprooted, and um, we live such extraordinarily hermetically sealed and insulated lives away from the natural world and the communities in which we would until quite recently have lived, that sense of longing for a place has been, it's a richness that we've lost. But in any case, yes, I think that the idea of fulfillment of a longing, as you say, if you, I mean, one really unfortunate way to think of what you said about the separation of the child from the mother is that really our longings are just sort of Freudian displacements for something that we're looking for. I think, I don't rule out that may be an element, but the trouble is that it somehow immediately devalues and degrades something that is actually powerful and is valued by us in the feeling of it, and seems to communicate with very much more than that. For instance, I think it is very strong in Wordsworth, who, for me is perhaps the greatest of all poets of all time. And in him, there is this feeling of oneness with the natural world, which is not, as it were, a surrogate for the feeling of oneness with the mother. But you could equally say that the feeling of oneness with the mother was an important preparation for his illumination that he and the natural world were not distinct, but were part of something that, he has all these wonderful phrases like something far more deeply interfused and something ever more about to be, again suggesting this business of a process that is always happening, not a finished act or a finished fact. And one of the themes that I'm just going to pull a blind down there.
Oh yes, I'm noticing that.
Sorry.
No problem.
Yes, one of the themes in the book that I've been writing is the idea that although there is value in thinking about things, that really much more important is to understand them as processes, which is not to say that there are no things, but that I want people to reconceive them in the light of the way in which they are processes. And that also includes my attitude to spiritual beliefs, religious beliefs. There's that I don't want to go off into all that, but it is quite an interesting topic for me, which is the idea that whatever it is, that the divine element in the cosmos and the cosmos are in a process of co-evolution, a constant coming into being, which is creative. And this is an idea that you also find in Alfred North Whitehead,
Process
who
theology.
I think is a brilliant philosopher. I mean, one of the authors of Principia Mathematica, but still a man of consummate sort of wise understanding and imagination. So yeah, so I would like to say, yes, that we shouldn't constantly be trying to cast one in our feelings about something now in terms of something to do with an unresolved problem in childhood, because after all, the really wonderful thing about the growing child is that at first it needs this feeling of fusion and so on, but it soon starts to recognize, very soon starts to recognize, that actually it is not swallowed up by the mother, but is distinct from the mother. And what I believe is that over that period of 3-4 years in which this process gets fulfilled, what a stable relationship between the mother and the child brings, and it depends very much on the right ventromedial frontal cortex of the mother in communion with the right ventromedial frontal cortex of the infant. And by the way, it is mothers, effectively. I'm sorry. Infants are not really that interested in their fathers until later.
Yeah.
So, but what I'm saying is that process enables the child to make the wonderful transition to being independent, but also not estranged or separate or atomistically divided from the mother. And that situation of being together but not fused is the richer experience, and it's carrying that forward into adulthood that leads to sane personalities that are able to, to navigate this relationship we have with what is other than ourselves, which includes the divine.
Yeah. And you can give of yourself when you are individuated. You can give something to the mother who bore you. And no, it's rich. And I'm really glad you nuanced that, because I was grasping, and I certainly didn't want to be transmitting a Freudian, worldview,
No.
except that it does highlight that, an unhealthy parent, an unhealthy mother could, instead of kind of facilitating that healthy distinction, could actually try to keep the coherence going, the cohesion going, or the the deep, and that would be false. And then you would have a longing, possibly for something that you can't achieve again, and you might not appreciate the separation that you do have, that allows you to have that perspective. So
a lot of psychopathology centers on this fusion of a mother with her often by now grown up daughter or son or whatever it might be, and or a father, but it usually again is the mother and a child that have this unhealthy fusion, which of course they inevitably think of as extremely positive.
Right.
Yeah. It's so wonderful that we're so close that we have to do everything together, and what one has to gently convey very kindly is that this is not in any way bad, but there are other ways of being that may be more fulfilling. Because it's always, and this is a really, really important point, it's always about the balance of centripetal forces with centrifugal forces.
Ooh, so what is centripetal? I know centrifugal.
Centrifugal is when things fly off apart. Centripetal is when they come the other way together. And so if there is not a balance, for example, if there's a balance between centrifugal and centripetal forces between the Earth and the Moon will continue to circle the Earth at a proper distance. But if the centrifugal forces became too strong, it would fly off into space. If the centripetal forces became too powerful, it would crash into the planet. And I often think that a good analogy or image of a healthy relationship is like these two celestial bodies that circle one another, and they're not just one, but then they're not flying apart either. And in that relationship, they become more themselves, not less themselves, which brings me back to the image of the proper evolution of the child in the loving care of the mother, who doesn't suffocate the child and try to keep it as a child. The thing there is that the child becomes more itself, and the mother actually becomes more herself. It's a pathological diminution of both when they stay toxically fused. I mean, these things ramify to so many places, but the structure that really, really is so important to me is one that was absolutely at the core of Goethe's philosophy. It's this one of, we need union and division, and we need them to be unified, not divided. Another way of putting that is, we need both and either or. But we don't need either both and or either or. So we have to have both the both and kind of dipole and the either or kind of dipole. And preferably they should be, or actually necessarily, they should both be under the aegis of a both and.
Sure.
And this comes back to yes, this is the also happens to the reality about the relationship between the right and left hemispheres. The right hemisphere tends to see both and, which is why it's able to see the possibility that something in its opposite may both be true, which the left hemisphere just doesn't compute. So the right hemisphere is able to see the both and. The left hemisphere tends to want either or, black and white. It's got to be this or it's got to be that. And we all know people who are like that, and certain movements in society that are like that. But what we desperately need is the overarching both and that can accommodate. Sometimes it's got to be either or, but let's try to make it as much as possible both and.
Nice.
And that the relationship is like that in the left hemisphere seems to not want to communicate so much with the right hemisphere as the right hemisphere is willing to communicate with the left hemisphere. And the right hemisphere has no kind of illusions about what it knows. It's able to acknowledge things that it doesn't know because it knows so much. Whereas the left hemisphere, because it knows so little, thinks that it knows everything. Yes. And again, we all know people like that.
Yes. Yeah. Well, I mean, this is, I really like the, I really like this as kind of a conclusion to the conversation in a way. I like that way of looking at things, and so I guess I will kind of wind down the situation and say that it's been an enormous, I mean, life goal, lifelong. I shouldn't say lifelong because I didn't know who you were when I was young, but speaking to you is a real honor, and I'm very, very grateful for the opportunity to do that, and I'm very excited about your new book, which I will chip away at over time, because the longing for what you're saying is there, and so when is it being published? Do you know, like, when will it be available?
Yes, it will be published on the 9th of November by Perspectiva Press in London. But from next week, I think from the Tuesday of next week, you will be able to pre-order a copy on either Channel McGilchrist or on Perspectiva's own website. And there are two advantages to doing that. One is that you get a discount, and the other is that you stand a tolerable chance of getting the book ahead of its official publication date.
Okay.
So if you're at all interested, next week, go to Channel McGilchrist and
Yes.
click the button.
Yeah, and as you know, I am, or you may know, or may not, I am a member of Channel McGilchrist, and have really enjoyed the discussions on there and everything. And I encourage people to if they engage deeply with your work, to go and join up Channel McGilchrist and meet other people. I do have to laugh at times at how accomplished the people there are. Like I feel like the I feel like the beggar at the banquet at times, because everyone there is so. Yes, I've been studying human psychology, and I'm also in my spare time I'm a rocket scientist, and it's woo, it's some amazing people, so I recommend it. But yeah.
Well, I should also just gloss that by saying there are lots of very good, intuitively wise people who are not telling us about all their marvelous things. But so don't be put off joining what I think is a very friendly forum.
It is very friendly, and it's been a good exercise in humility for me to because they've all been wonderful. So, thank you very much for speaking to me today. This has been everything I hoped it would be.
Well, you're very kind, Aaron, and thank you very much for inviting me.